Welcome to Everyday Discipleship Every Day, where we discuss discipleship in the 21st century, basically based on the first century from the Bible, where we are guided by biblical discipleship, a Christian worldview, and individual needs, while focusing on discipling our children at the same time. I'm your host, Terry Hellard Brown, and I'm putting my book on discipleship that I've been working on for many years on my blog posts. And you can download each chapter as I put those there. I'm editing it, so sometimes, they come little by little, but those are there for you to use. They're free to download, and eventually we'll have the whole book on there in my blog. So you can go to that at terryhellardbrown.com. Today, I'm really excited about the conversation we had with Christie Thomas. And she is a writer and has some wonderful books, but she has a really great book coming out that I know will encourage you. And I really encourage you to get her book. It's called Little Habits, Big Faith. And what she's talking about is how to build in these small, sustainable habits into our walk with God, but also in our discipleship, especially when we're discipling our children at home. And so this is a wonderful book, and we had a wonderful conversation about discipleship and what it looks like for our families today. And I can't wait for you to hear all that she had to share. I know you're going to be blessed. So let's join the conversation. Well, today we have with us Christie Thomas. Thank you for joining us today, Christie.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to jump into a conversation about your newest book that's coming out, Little Habits, Big Faith. And so tell us the story behind it a little bit, and then let's talk about discipleship.
For sure. Well, there's a long story behind it, but I'm going to tell you the short story. So, over the past few years, I was working as a children's ministry director for a long time, and I was doing some family discipleship stuff there. And then I retired from my job as the children's ministry director and started doing specifically family discipleship stuff online. And over the past few years, I've talked with so many parents who feel like frustrated with the expectations they feel when it comes to sharing Jesus with their kids. So parents feel super busy and pulled in like many different directions. We struggle with how faith was presented to us as kids, and we don't want to do
True.
it the same thing to our kids. We've seen how legalistic or hypocritical or pushy Christians have turned our own peers away from God, and we don't want to do that to our kids. So
Mhm.
there's a little bit of fear going on there. Or we feel inadequate to do it well. We're too busy, or we didn't grow up in a Christian school, or my husband can do it better, or we're just untrained. So the story behind it is really I discovered the power of little faith habits in our lives and how they have this unexpectedly huge fruit in our lives.
Mm.
And I really just hope that parents will discover that the best way forward isn't just to blast our way through on our own strength, because that is not what any part of our faith life is supposed to be, but just to take these small steps and trusting God's strength. I love the story. It's kind of this like weird little story from the Old Testament. After the Israelites came back from exile, they started building the temple again. And then they stopped because the Samaritans and the people around them wrote to the king of the world basically and said, "Hey, these guys are building their temple, and if they build their temple, then they're going to riot against you, and so they should stop." And so the Israelites were like, "No, no, 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 we don't want to go into exile again. We're going to stop." So they stopped building the temple, and they kind of kept living their lives and building their homes. But one night, a young priest named Zechariah has a dream, and God says, "Hey, basically, you have to start building the temple again. And you have to start small because the temple isn't going to be built until you start putting those stones down." And in the NLT, it's kind of my favorite translation for a lot of reasons. But Zechariah 4:10 says, "Do not despise these small beginnings, because the Lord rejoices to see the work begin." And just like the temple they had to start rebuilding it by putting a single stone on top of another single stone. That's how faith is built in our lives. God just takes our little faithfulness and he turns it into a lot.
I love that. That's so awesome. So, when you mentioned that so many of us are living kind of in fear right now, I say we go through this time where we're just waiting for our children to pray that prayer, And then we're like, phew, okay, good. And then then they get to be a little older, and now we're hearing about deconstruction and all of this, and we're like, oh no, now I've got to freak out about that. And I love that your book, it just kind of helps us take a breath and have peace about what God is calling us to do as parents, and feel encouraged that even if we feel ill-equipped, God is there. He's our equipper, He's our enabler, and He's the one bringing the fruit. And that's what I love. I think this book would be a great encouragement for any parent who's wanting to see their children discipled and following Christ. And like you say, you even say it in the book too. We say it all the time. There's no guarantee. We can absolutely do everything what we consider absolute right, and our child still has a free will.
Yes,
and
they do.
and their relationship with God is their relationship with God. They can't, ride along on our, what is it, shirt tails that we always they've got to have their own faith and their own relationship with God. And so, yeah, there's no guarantee, but we need to stop beating ourselves up and trying to preach our kids or argue our kids into the kingdom, but little by little letting them see God in our lives. I always say it's the nooks and crannies of life, the life that
Mhm.
we bring discipleship into those teachable moments that God gives us.
Yeah, I love that. I think I actually used that phrase at one point in the book, tucking these little habits into the nooks and crannies of our lives. I just wanted to go back a minute to fear because we don't talk about this enough. And I see this a lot in Christian parenting books, actually. This is one of the reasons I stopped reading Christian parenting books for quite a while because I was like, the first chapter was always about, oh my goodness, our world is falling apart and our kids are turning away from Christ. And I'm like, okay, sure, but that's not really any different from the first Christians who were existing in the Roman times. And they literally went, instead of going to the movies to watch people pretend to kill each other, they went to watch gladiators murder each other. Like
Yeah.
that was their entertainment. That was their culture. Our culture is not really any worse than theirs. And yet Christianity flourished because people were seeing the beauty of it. So I just like to take back, like, to step away from that fear, because
Yeah.
when we start as our premise, oh my goodness, my kids are going to get sucked into this world and I have to do everything I can, and it's fear that is our motivator.
Mm.
Guess what we do? We lay down the law and we say, of course you have to come to church. And oh my goodness, I can't believe you believe that or you're questioning that. And we end up with these kids who go, whoa, I'm not allowed to ask those questions. Or whoa, I like, they put walls up and they push us away because we're reacting out of fear. So if we can remember that there is no fear in love, and
That's
that perfect love casts out fear, and that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of self discipline, then we can step out of that fear that our children will turn away. And I mean, it's not a bad fear. Like, I don't want my children to turn away from God. But if we can't parent out of that, because when we
right.
parent out of that, we are not great parents. Like, so then if we can step away from that, then we can, I think, make better choices and healthier choices. We can take a deep breath instead of yelling at our kids about their questions. We can say, "Oh, why do you think that? Tell me more about that," instead
Mhm.
of lecturing them. And those are the kind of things that actually help our kids grow deeper in faith when we have those conversations with them without getting, oh, her hair raised or whatever the hackles up. That's what the actual phrase is.
Yeah, and it's really true. And it's true when we're discipling anyone, because today, we're gonna encounter people who have very different beliefs than we've grown up with. It's not enough just to teach them how to read the Bible and that they need to go to church. We're gonna have to answer those tough questions. And if we don't know the answers, we just have to admit, I don't know the answer. Let's look it up together, or, or talk to someone who does know the answer. But I've shared this story on other episodes, but I was discipling a young woman who came out of a Taoist background in Taiwan. She's reading her Bible, like, she's devouring her Bible and reading it every day, and has all these questions, and I'm like, "Wow," she's always challenging me. But then one day, reincarnation came up. Well, I never thought to even talk about reincarnation, And so then we were able to talk about that because she believed that reincarnation was real, and it just stopped because she became a Christian. So it wasn't that it wasn't real in her mind, it was just that it stopped at that point, so the cycle would end. And so we had to address that, we had to unteach some things, and as our kids encounter weird ideas and ideas contrary to the Bible in our culture today, we need to be ready to, if nothing else, allow them to ask the questions. Like I said, even if we don't know the answers, they need to feel free to come to us and ask anything they can. And I love that. I was just talking with Elizabeth Urbanowitz, who is the founder of Foundation Worldview, and they talk about building a biblical worldview and helping our children. She was talking about how our children need to feel free to ask us anything, but also we need to be ready to tell them and share with them our faith and our beliefs and a biblical worldview, because whoever they hear something from first has more power. We become that expert. But if we don't address those things, they're going to hear something from someone else, and we're no longer the expert. We're no longer the one they come to with their questions. They're going to go to this other person or this other entity, if it's a school or whatever, and think that they know more than we do. And so as parents, we just cannot live in that fear and be afraid to talk about anything. I drive my kids crazy because from the beginning, I always said, you can ask me anything. And I talked about anything. And they're like, ah.
So really anything.
Yeah,
Okay,
because
good.
my parents didn't talk about anything. I would go and ask a question point blank, and they'd like, you don't need to know that.
Wait until you're older. Well, I
Yeah.
remember, like, talking about pornography and, in child appropriate ways with my boys when they were quite young, and I had some friends who were like, I'm just gonna wait a few years." I'm like, "If you wait a few years, they're gonna hear about it on the bus, they're gonna find it online, they're gonna hear about it in class, in Sunday school." I've been hearing
Mhm.
nasty stories from our local Christian school, the elementary school. Like,
Wow.
they're gonna hear it, so
Yeah.
you're exactly right. We need to be that first place, and we don't have to know all the answers, but we do need to be the place, or, like, basically a trustworthy place where they can ask those
Yes.
questions.
And
Absolutely.
not be, like you said, yelled at or punished for asking the question. Yeah. So, what advice would you give a brand new parent who is starting out? Maybe they're new in their faith or just learning to navigate their own walk with Christ. What advice would you give them?
Well, I would say, first of all, just remember that we don't parent out of fear. Let's go back to that. Let's remember that is not our starting place. Our starting place, what is our starting place? Our starting place is that we want our children to know how deeply God loves them, and that's our starting place. So, whether your children are older or just a baby, you can just start with something really tiny. And I would recommend asking God what would be the best thing to do. So, I could give you like three things that you could do, and I'll give you some suggestions, but they may not be the right thing for you. So that's
Mm,
another thing I actually talk about in the book, is that we often have this kind of one size fits all
right.
idea that faith formation needs to look a certain way. But as I've grown and talked to many families about this, I've realized it looks so different in many families. And the families that are, quote unquote, successful are often not the ones that you expect. So, some little tiny things that you could try with your family is you could start by just saying the Lord's Prayer with them every day. The Lord's Prayer is the prayer that God gave us. And, sometimes it's going to feel rote and like you're just parroting words. But then there are other times when you're going to be like, oh, yeah, we do need to ask for forgiveness right now. Or we do need to ask God for our daily bread. And God, this is specifically what my daily bread is. So something like the Lord's Prayer, which, God has given us, or something like this nighttime blessing. This is something that I started teaching in my church actually before I had kids. I just kind of got a curriculum pack of family faith formation ideas. And I was like, oh, this is great. Let's teach this to our 2-year-old parents. And so basically, we just talked about the power of praying a blessing over your child every night. And I recently talked to a lady from my church she's a grandma now, actually. She came to my very first class. So her kids would have been pretty young. This was probably about 16 years ago. So she came to my first class. And so she started praying this biblical blessing over her children every night. And she was sitting at my kitchen table last year and she was like crying. She said, you know what, Christy, when you pray for God to bless your child every single day for their entire life, don't be surprised when he does.
Wow.
And And so all her 3 daughters are walking with God now, and the one, like I said, she's a grandma now, so the one has married an amazing Christian man. They have a baby now, and so they're passing on this little tiny habit to the next generation. And I'm just like so in awe that God took my just stumbling obedience and used it to do something that is passing down through the generations now. And that's not something new. I mean, that's from the Old Testament. It's from the book of Numbers. So people have been doing this for 4,000 years. But I do talk to a lot of people who are like, "Oh, you can do that? I never thought of that." So if this is something that you haven't tried before, I challenge you just to try look up the priestly blessing from Numbers. It's the one that says, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he turn his face toward you and give you peace." And you could just put your hand on your child's head or their arm and speak that just before you walk out the door at night. So that is kind of where I love to start. I have not heard of anybody who was like, "Well, Christy, that was a terrible idea." And it did not work for my family. Maybe they're just not the ones talking to me about it. But I've heard amazing stories that come out of just that tiny little thing. I just think it's a fantastic way to start. If you're already doing something like that, you can mix it up, choose a different verse. You could try reading just like one Bible verse a day. Really just think a lot smaller than you're currently thinking
Yeah.
because the small things are sustainable. You can continue to do them even when you have surgery, even when summer happens and your schedule is thrown off. You can continue to do them when you move because they're easy and you can expand on them. That's part of the what I talk about in the book too is a lot of these things we do want to expand upon, but we just start with something little and let God help us grow it.
That's great. Yeah.
That was long advice.
No, that's good. So, what would be your advice to someone whose child is rebelling against faith and maybe struggling with what they believe? What would be your advice for that parent?
Oh, you know what? I'm going to use a different book to talk about this because I've
Okay.
been reading a book right now called Parenting Teens for a Life of Faith. And it is
Mm.
absolutely brilliant because a lot of times the things that we're doing in childhood are more like this teaching and training. But then when they're teenagers and they're starting to ask those questions or look at kind of like rebelling, then we kind of have to approach them a little bit differently. So one of the things she talks about in there is we have to unwind. So, our teenagers and all of us can easily get these wrong impressions of God or the Bible. And so, our job as parents is to try and figure out what's going on and see where the knot in their faith is. Like, it's like a skein of wool, and something is twisted up in there, and we need to figure out what it is. So, say they don't want to come to church anymore. Let's see if we can figure out what it is instead of just saying, "Okay, no, you have to come to church." Let's see if we can figure out what we need to untwist there. So maybe they're feeling like they don't have a place in the church. Maybe they're feeling like there's no point in being there. Maybe they just don't like getting up early in the morning. What exactly is it that is causing them to say, "No, I don't want to go to church anymore"? Because teenagers will often just, say things in the most rude way possible, right? So our job as parents is to try and figure out what's actually happening down in their hearts and then see if we can kind of gently unwind that. Not with a lecture, but maybe by telling them a story from our own life. Like, I didn't really feel like I had a place in church for a long time either until I started serving in children's ministry. And I felt like I belonged there and I was good at what I was doing. And I just loved being with the little kids. And they made me feel like I belonged when I didn't feel like I belonged with the teenagers or with the adults. So a story like that might help your teenager. Maybe you could then say, "Do you think that you might like to try and find a place where you're needed, where you belong?" So maybe they want to join or check out, maybe not join right away, but maybe they want to check out the worship team, or maybe they want to check out being in the nursery, or they want to check out sitting at the back and helping with the slides. That's actually what my
Mhm.
teenager is doing right now. And it's so cool to see him sitting at the back and chatting with all these adults because he's kind of awkward with teenagers his own age, but with adults, he's fantastic, which is great because he's going to be an adult a lot longer than he's going to be a teenager. So I don't
Good point.
mind. So he is starting to feel like he has a place at church. So basically, my answer to your question is let's figure out where the knot is
Mhm.
and then start to unwind that through stories of our own life and just gently, gently unwinding, not through lectures.
Yeah. And what was the name of that book again?
It's called Parenting Teens for a Life of Faith.
Okay, and who wrote that?
That's a really good question. Okay, it comes out of the UK actually,
Okay,
through a ministry called Parenting for Faith,
okay.
BRF.
I'll look
It's
it up. I'll
under
have the link in the show notes. We'll find
Yeah,
it.
it is quite fantastic and kind of feels like the next step from my book actually. So
Uh-huh. That's
I
good.
really enjoyed it.
Megan Hill also wrote something along those lines too, but I can't think of the name of her book. But she talks a lot about finding that knot and
Hmm,
untangling it too. So kind of the same idea. We'll put that link in the show notes and we'll have the link to your book. And before we finish up today, I do want you to share about some of your other books just so people know and tell us about how they can find you on the internet.
for sure. Well, most places, I if you look up Little Shoots Deep Roots, you'll find me. So that's my website name. You can find me on Instagram by that name. I'm kind of on Facebook a little bit. If you look up Little Shoots Deep Roots, you'll find me. Was it for a while on TikTok by that name, but then I gave up on that. So mostly just Instagram and my website. And most of this is actually my first book for adults. Most of my other books are written for other families or directly for children, like my picture books. I have a couple family devotional style, so a mother son prayer journal. I have a family devotional on the fruit of the spirit, which is a little bit different from some of the other fruit of the spirit that you might see. It really focuses on Jesus and how he shows the fruit of the spirit. So kind of as our model, but not just as our model, also as the person who enables us to live out the fruit
Mm,
of the spirit. Because I often find fruit of the spirit stuff is very legalistic, very
yeah.
much like a checkbox, like a to-do list. And so I wanted to step away from that and say the fruit of the spirit is it's the fruit of the spirit. It comes when you're like you have the spirit working in your life. It's not the fruit of Christy trying harder.
I
So we
love
look at Jesus. Yeah. Not the fruit of Christy, it's the fruit of the spirit. Like let's look at the actual name. It's not just a list of great character traits to emulate. It is what we start to look like when we draw closer to Christ. So
that.
the
Mm,
easiest way to draw closer to Christ for a child is to learn the stories of Christ. So we look through all the gospels and it's almost like we go through with a magnifying glass and see how does Jesus show joy? How does he show faithfulness and patience and
wow,
self-control? And then, okay, so how might the Holy Spirit want to do these things in my life?
that's awesome.
So it's called Fruitful, 100 Family Experiences for Growing in the Fruit of the Spirit. It's really just a devotion book, but I got outvoted on the title. I would have called it 100 Family Devotions, but that's okay. There are some like actual little activities in there too that you can do. And then I have actually coming out very soon here is a reboot of I have a preschool devotional that is an interactive, play based walk through the entire Bible. And that was called Wise for Salvation. But now that is off the table. And now it's called My First Devotional. And it's fully illustrated and it's coming out in September. So I'm
Cool.
very excited about that. Two books launching at the same time is not pretty, but that's the one that I was doing with my son that it was like 1 to 2 minutes a day. That's what I was doing with him. And that gave him such a good biblical foundation in kindergarten. I have picture books, Quinn's Promise Rock, and Quinn Says Goodbye. And I think that is it. Did I get the whole list?
I think so, pretty close, yeah.
Okay, good.
Well, and I love it because your book, Little Habits, Big Faith, is about how to disciple our kids, and then you'll have the devotional that they can practice it. So that's
Exactly.
perfect that they're coming out at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And it's for preschoolers. I just had the one like Fruitful is geared more to elementary kids. So now
Okay,
we're coming back around to this. It really is the philosophy of my entire life. The little things are the things that are realistic and sustainable and they add up and become a lot.
that's cool. Well, I have appreciated so much your book. I've enjoyed reading it, and just talking with you has been a blast. So, thank you for sharing with us. And we look forward to hearing from you more and finding out more books that you have in the future. Please let us know. We'll have you back on.
Okay. Sounds great.
We're so glad you joined us today and hope that you were blessed and even a little challenged by the conversation. Our prayer is that we can obey Jesus' command to make disciples as we reach and equip this generation of believers to reach and equip the next generation of believers with everyday discipleship every day.